let them put the fear on you. Sold down the river, but not a word of it was true. If there's nothing you can say, there may be nothing you can do. Stand and deliver. Stand and deliver. Determined for a match too.
I'm biracial, I'm bilingual, I'm multicultural. The fact is, in America, in North Carolina, I can do anything I want, and I teach that to my children. And the person who tells my little pecan-colored kids that they're somehow oppressed based on the color of their skin would be absolutely wrong and absolutely at war with me. And I think that's the same for every parent. What the mask showed us is that the parents, the most powerful group of people in our country, that they're taking back the wheel. Now, obviously, we had to take the wheel back for the mask, but we're taking the wheel back from Washington all the way to Raleigh and into our local school board. Because CRT, all of that, the parents don't want it. It's a big fat lie. There's not one, if you believe in CRT, I want to tell you you're a liar. Because that means you look at your black neighbor and say that they're oppressed, and you look at your white neighbor and say that they're evil, regardless of the experience that you've had with them. And we're not going to do that. The parents in the United States of America, right here in North Carolina and Cabarrus County, we know that's not true because we believe the lives we live. The fact is, I've been a business owner right here in North Carolina, and I deal with white people, black people, Hispanic people. My children deal with everybody. And the racism is only happening at the government level and on the media. The fact is, you have racists, and there's you can't even find them hardly. You just hear the stories about them. But this is what we're dealing with. The parents are taking the wheel. I have an 8-year-old daughter who is absolutely dynamic, who can do anything. Athletically, intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally, she is a dynamo. And I don't want a man swimming against her in the pool. The fact is, I don't want her playing against boys in soccer. I don't even let my sons rough her up. Do you think I'm going to let your son rough her up? This is what we're talking about. Policy going back to the parents. Because if you think people who love America are willing to fight for it, you haven't met parents yet. Because I'm telling you, parents will go further down any street than anyone who loves their country alone. My name is Brian Echevarria. I thank you for your service, and we're taking back the wheel.
There are many whites who are trying to solve the problem, but you never see them going under the label of liberals. That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox. And a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to. But the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling.
When God created man upon earth, from an Adam and Eve time, and Adam and Eve, them have children and things, and them go on bad, and God never liked the way how man was going on. So him tell Noah, build a ark. A thing like a ship or a boat, one of them big ark business. Noah build the ark, Noah building the ark, the people them say Noah build the ark, and them say, what that? These guys are nuts. It's just like a man come and him say Rastafari, and people them say, what that? I don't know about that. I mean, you know what I mean? Anyhow, Noah build the ark, God tell him what he must do. In Noah, him 3 sons, and him son, the wife, the woman that was with the sons them, and Noah's woman, and all the peers, animals, and everything God said must get a peer, right? And when the ark finished and flood came and destroyed the rest of the people them. All of them dead off except Noah them. But Noah had 3 sons. One named Ham, one named Shem, and one named Japheth.
Yeah.
Well, from that 3 sons there and the rest a woman where they bought the place, they multiply all these people on the face of the earth. You know? So, but mankind get lost again because, I don't know, mankind get lost somewhere down the line that them don't really, man become enemy. You know, the consciousness that Noah is our father, it come like it don't mean anything to people, but it mean a great deal to the Rasta man because him know that is the truth. And that's why him say love, and that's why him understand everything. You know, that's one of the little part about the unification of the people. Because what the people have to realize that Noah had 3 sons. Well, him give Africa to Ham, which is a black man. Him give Europe to Japheth, which is a white man. And him give Asia to the Chinese, the yellow people, them like, you know, Asian people. So that is how, but I mean, you know, it never say, well, then it's bad as on the earth and me shouldn't come over your side, come look for you or anything like that. We're supposed to be like people on the face of the earth who God created.
If white immigrants can come to this country 50 years ago with nickels and dimes and no education, and come here and pool their little nickels and dimes and no education, and set up little stores, develop these stores into larger stores, develop this into an industry which creates job opportunities for whites. Since Lincoln was supposed to have freed the black man 100 years ago, and today the black man, according to the government economist, has spending power of $20 billion per year. We feel that with the black man spending $20 billion a year, not setting up any businesses, not creating any industry, not creating any job opportunities for his own kind, he's not in a moral position to point the finger today at the white man and tell the white man that he's discriminating against him for not giving him a job in factories that he himself set up. If the black man has $20 billion, and these so-called Negro leaders are such geniuses that they can integrate white restaurants and integrate white factories and force themselves into that which the white man has set up, they should use this same ingenuity to show the black people how to pool our wealth and set up something of our own. And then we won't have to force our way into his anymore. One more thing I would like to point out concerning what he said about 125th Street. We don't waste our time on 125th Street, but you can reach more people in the street who want to change than you can in the bourgeoisie society, the bourgeoisie church, and the bourgeoisie circles. Our program is directed toward the man in the street. So we spend our time in the street, and what we do with that man, instead of trying to change the white man and your mind and make you accept us, we change the mind of the black man and make him accept himself. And as soon as he accepts himself, he'll solve his own problem. He won't be trying to force himself into your factory and into your bedroom and into your kitchen.
Whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chopped in his plate.
I'd like to point out, though, that...
I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro, who actually differs from the white conservative in the same way that the fox differs from the wolf. Their appetite is the same. Their motives are the same. It's only their mannerisms and methods that differ.
Today, you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.
Where the big ass mounds at now? That shows that and you don't have any jobs. Where's the noise at now? From the faces, this color fix I see every day on the internet. I'm trying to get YouTube to kick me off so I can sue their asses. And people don't believe that. I don't pay taxes or drive with a license because I was willing to go to the line. It cost me 2 weeks in jail for the driver's license. The taxes I haven't heard from the IRS yet. Question, make them answer you as a person. Why do I owe it to you? I gave them 21 days to respond. They said nothing. So I guess I don't exist. That's acquiescence in law. I haven't paid them shit. They haven't come for me because if they do, when somebody's willing to take that long ride, it's not going to look good. And I'm not in the system. Like, I got stomach cancer in 2016, so that shut me down from work and everything but life. You know what I'm saying? That was the only thing important. So I wasn't scared. I'm looking at death. I'm not worried about paying rent, none of that shit. So I stopped looking at law. They lied about everything. Both sides are in on it. The Republicans, and they're trying to jump in now like they mean us well. They're just trying to jump in and pick up with the hole that Trump left, that vacuum that he left, the truth came out. Because we had an American in office, not a Republican, not a Democrat. He was a good businessman, and he did business for the country. But you tell somebody he a racist because he won't say black people in particular, this group of people in particular. And then the media that we had, like that part. That's the worst part. But yeah.
Blacks for freedom.
Yeah, America, man. We like, if you call yourself black around us, we like, you trying to get something. Stand up on the premise that the country was built on. That was immigrants. And I do the history here. The Irish, the Italians, they weren't friends when they got here. You don't belong here either. Before they was calling you, we know all of it. The culture that we exhibit now, it came from Great Britain. They learned that, and they were proud of their cracker culture there. They brought it here in the South. Blacks picked it up. Now they calling it Black Power. And you were Tom if you don't act like a nigga. Like, y'all, they don't even know. They don't even know. But they can't call me a Tom because I talk like them. You know what I'm saying? I'm not Brian Gumble, and I'm not Larry Elder. I like, fuck your mother too. Like, it's the same thing. Like, somebody... You gotta fight where you at. You know what I'm saying? There's places that I can fight that y'all can't fight. And vice versa.
Amen.
We tell blacks all the time, which person black signed any bill to say slavery was over? They don't want to deal with it.
Say it again.
Which black hand signed anything to say slavery was over? Whose mind thought this shit was wrong? Was it your dumbass ancestors that fought for their right to vote for their masses? Dumb cocksuckers. They didn't fight for their freedom, right? But they fought for their right to vote. We telling our kids that's a lie. The first thing you fight for is to be free. You got Haiti, they were dark colored people, not much fought for their right to be free. Ethiopia the same way. What happened to you cocksuckers here? Why didn't y'all fight? Why? Because it's a lie. All of it's a lie. The trip from Africa is a lie. The people were here got enslaved, but it wasn't everybody.
The trip from Africa, you said?
No, it's no way. It was a document written in 1452, 1493 by Pope Nicholas V. It's called the Dum Diversas Papers. And it's based off the Catholic Church saying if you wasn't a Christian, you could be enslaved and subjugated. And that was for Portugal and Spain. And the people that were here that wasn't Christian, they enslaved. Nobody came from Africa. That's a bunch of horseshit. They think that even if you paid $1 for a slave, they talking about this Middle Passage where over 2 million slaves died. Who's gonna pay that kind of money when you can subjugate the people that's in all lands? So all the slave trade shit is garbage. They might have took people to some places where they needed help, but they enslaved what was already here, and it's based on Christianity. That's it.
But there's no doubt that the slave trade did come out of Africa.
Nah, not here. Not here. Not here.
Caribbean area?
Not here. From the Caribbeans is still over this way. They took people from here to other places. They didn't bring anybody from Africa. It doesn't make sense. When you could enslave them. Read the Dum Diversas Papers, Documents of Discovery. It's on YouTube. Check it out yourself. It's been written like 7 times. It's an edict from the Catholic Church.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Yep. Yes, check it out. African slave trade is garbage.
They weren't the only ones that were enslaved.
enslaved, so we keep talking about other cultures were enslaved.
It was
Yeah,
way of
and-
life.
and if
It was
you-
warlordism. If I could kick your ass and take your shit, that's what I did.
And if you go back, and in Africa, culturally, if you are of slave heritage, you can't intermarry with a non-slave heritage. There's a caste system, and it doesn't matter how far you go back.
It's a caste
People don't talk about that either.
Look, man, I can tell you about the slavery for me. I'm 50, I'll be 55 this year. I'm born in 1967. Slavery is over in 1865. I had a grandmother that's 50 years plus older than me, my grandfather. We never talked about slavery. If that happened, if somebody gets shot in your family, you know it from generation to generation. That wasn't in my family. And I'm not getting this media, the people that's in charge, to write their papers and tell me my history. It's in your mouth. It was oral tradition. Everybody isn't always right. That's another thing.
But you're saying that your family, your ancestors were enslaved.
Yep.
But that is to say that I'm not sure what you're saying.
That's to say how many other black people think like I think.
Yeah.
They just go along with take the vax. See, that's a part of it.
Yeah,
The critical thinking is the problem. When you have do-gooders that want to say, see, that's why we got to talk. It's okay, don't take up for black people. Don't do it. Let me work. Let me work. Let me work. I know that. What's in it for me to say this? That's the first thing you have to ask yourself. The agenda at the end. So I look at everybody like, what's your agenda? What do you mean well? People don't stand up well with that. When you look them right in their eyes and ask them, what do you mean? What are you trying? Do you want to win an argument or you want resolution? That slave shit didn't happen. It didn't happen.
What aspect are you saying didn't happen? I'm
The
not sure what
aspect
you're
that they
saying.
said that it dominated America. Let me tell you what slavery was. It's a caste system again, because some people were slaves here, but it wasn't at the magnitude that they made it out. And when some of those slaves got free, they were working. It was work. The same with the Irish. So the mistreating of these people, we can't possibly know. That was Alex Haley, and that came out fraudulent, how they was treated. But I do know Irish and blacks were housed in the same places, and they start using caste with them, telling them if they acted a certain way that they'd be a part of the system. Those became like slave catchers and police. Slavery was a mark of being a free and successful man. There was plenty of blacks that had.
Slavery, you say?
That's what it was. When
Slavery
some, listen. When they freed some of the slaves, they kept slaves. When masters left plantations, the blacks, they had slaves like anybody else. And it wasn't because they hated blacks. It was the mark of being free. It was the caste system. The whole world dealt with slavery. We kicked your ass, you're part of our society. That's how this country was founded. That's the Christianity that you know about now. Because it was put on everybody, not just blacks. This land, China, everywhere. Warlordism. And that's how everything was established. And they control the books. When they control the books, and my family believed that you were racist. You understand what I'm saying? And we got a lot of documentation to prove that you were white supremacist. You understand what I'm saying now? So if you don't challenge it, you're going to go along with it. And there's different levels. I don't pay taxes. And I'm not anti-American. I don't drive with a license either. And I'm not anti-American. You can take me in a courtroom and prove to me why I should, I'll do it. It's a different conversation when you're standing on the word of God. Like, I'm an American. Now you gotta pull me out of that. I don't care about black, gay, Jew, none of that. This country was founded on what? My freedom to say, fuck you. Not punch you in the mouth, but to say it, but not to follow you around, antagonize me. Like, fuck you. If I want to go live and say fuck you to the world, it's your choice whether you come in and listen. If I'm running around following, harassing, that's different. People play that narrative out a lot till, well, you're harassing me, get the fuck in the house. This is America. People fought for this shit. They fought for your right. They fought for your right to record the police kicking somebody's black ass. What if the police said, get the fuck out of here? Because they had the power to do it. It's not right. So freedom is both sides. You have a right to speak and a right to be quiet, not just one. You know what I'm saying? But what you get is what they put on you. And you might, I'm quite sure my grandmother wasn't a nasty old lady, but I couldn't bring anybody white home. You understand what I'm saying? Where did she even get that shit from?
I get it
so
from the
if
other
I don't
side.
stand on this stuff, who am I waiting for? Who are my kids gonna wait to see that this shit ain't right? If I'm not willing to put it all out there That's what this country is. And it's not black. It's not white. If they can put you in, or don't say this about the gays, well, I keep the word of God. Leviticus 18 and 22 say don't lay down with a man like you lay down with a woman. And I don't know anybody gay personally, so I'm throwing it out there to homosexuality. If you land under that umbrella, I don't know what to tell you, dog, but we don't have a homosexual construction union, a lesbian or gay construction union. Let's be real. We don't have a women's bricklayers union.
Right.
Don't fuck around. This country was built off some other shit than your emotions.
Yep.
And I get right in your fucking face and make you prove otherwise. So I'm silenced on a lot of networks.
Economic facts and fallacies, quote, some things are believed because they are demonstrably true, but many other things are believed simply because they have been asserted repeatedly, close quote. You wish to let that gloomy observation on human nature stand?
Yes.
Race wasn't the basis of slavery?
Oh, it's a simple historical matter. Slavery existed for thousands of years, as far back as there are any records of human beings. Archaeological finds suggest that slavery existed before human beings could read and write. So, what a racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first black African to the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, but so you're not suggesting, you do not wish to say anything other than that slavery as practiced in the United States it may have been recent, but you'd be willing to grant that it was particularly perverse and destructive because race got mixed into it at that point, right?
Race got mixed into it in the United States more than anywhere else for a very simple reason. The United States was founded, as the Declaration said, of independence, said all men are created equal.
Right.
If that's true, then the only way you can justify slavery is to say that some men are less than men.
I see. So the racial
but in Brazil, where Brazil imported more slaves than the United States, there was no such ideology. Brazil was not a democratic country. The whole issue never arose.
I see. All right. Race doesn't account for differences in black-white income?
No, the differences between income between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans is greater than the difference between blacks and whites in the United States. Differences in income are the rule, they are not the exception.
So, looking at all these sociological studies that show a persistent gap between African Americans in income and every other form of American in income is what? Useless? It tells us things that we don't need to know. It misleads us. How would you describe that?
Wrong, I think, sums it up. It is not true. Hispanics have a lower per capita income than blacks. Hispanic households and families have a higher income than black households and families, simply because the Hispanic families are larger.
Economic facts and fallacies. A fallacy is that the current fatherless families so prevalent among contemporary blacks are a legacy of slavery, where families were not recognized under slavery. This ignores the fact that the problem has become much worse among generations of blacks far removed from slavery than among generations closer to the era of slavery, yes. Close quote. Explain that.
You mean explain why it is so, or
yes? Yeah, why is that? Why? What on earth is going on there? That is so counter to what we assume.
Well, first of all, most people have not recognized the fact that if you go back into the 20s, you find that married couple families were much more prevalent among blacks then than today. You find also, incidentally, that the blacks were, as late as 1930, blacks had lower unemployment rates than whites. So all these things that we complain about and attribute to the era of slavery, those things should have been worse in the past than in the present.
Right.
But in fact, they're worse in the present than in the past. And I think if you want to look for a turning point, it would be since the 1960s.
And what happened in the 1960s?
Oh, you began to have not only the welfare state, you began to have the mindset that goes with the welfare state, so that there was no stigma any longer attached, for example, to being on relief or welfare.
And so, but why? Well, illegitimacy is exploding now among, it's high among Hispanics,
Yes.
and it's exploding among whites. But the Moynihan report, when was that, Tom?
Oh, in the 60s, 64, 65.
When Moynihan talked about the illegitimacy rate among
Yes.
blacks, which was exploding then. So what if the welfare state changes the way Americans think?
Yes.
Why did black Americans prove susceptible to that change first?
Because they were poor. I don't think that many Asian American girls who are preparing to go off to Stanford or Harvard are going to say, hey, well, I can live on welfare, why should I abstain?
Distinguish the two, race and discrimination.
Well, racism is an attitude inside people's heads.
Right.
Discrimination is an overt act taking place outside in the real world.
Okay.
So not only with blacks, but you find the same thing with Jews in previous centuries, that part of the United States where there was the most racism against blacks, namely the South,
right,
is where black construction workers were much more common than they were in the North, right on into the 20th century. And most people are unaware that in the South, blacks were the construction workers. I remember a professor at Howard University saying that when he was a boy in the South, his father pointed to some man on the street and said, he was the first white construction worker in this town.
And so what was going on there? The racism did not, so whites could think of blacks as somehow or other separate, but they'd still employ them because the market made it profitable to do so.
Yeah, in fact, yes. In fact, a law had to be passed to stop this because in the 20s, and particularly as the Depression got underway, black construction companies in the South using black non-union labor would come up to the North and underbid on government contracts, taking them away. And so this was very common, to the point where they passed the Davis-Bacon Act, which said that on government contracts you must pay the prevailing wage, which translated almost invariably into the union wage.
Right. So your point on the distinction between racism and discrimination is, don't worry about racism. It's inside people's heads. You can't measure it. There's a strongly subjective, just forget about it, concentrate only on discrimination, and the best answer to discrimination is to let markets operate, because then people will discover, it will tend to militate against discrimination. When people have skills to offer, they'll be employed. Whatever this notion of racism in people's heads is, don't worry about that. Is that right?
Yeah, what I'm saying essentially is that racists may prefer one race to another, but they prefer themselves to everybody else.
So they'll do what's profitable.
That's right. That's right.
Got it.
And
Okay.
that was even true in South Africa under apartheid, that there were hundreds of construction companies in South Africa that were fined in a government crackdown because they were hiring more blacks and in higher positions than they were allowed to under the apartheid law, because that was where the money was.
Once again, race and culture, economic facts and fallacies. Race is used as a sorting device for decision-making, even by people who are not racists. Thus, employers may be reluctant to hire young black males because these employers are aware of what a high proportion of them have been arrested or imprisoned, even if the employers have no antipathy to black people as such and readily hire older blacks or black females, close quote. Are you saying that discrimination, even on the basis of race, you're saying it can be rational, do you want to suggest that it can be acceptable?
Well, that's a different question.
Yes,
but I do notice that among a group of employers who routinely check everyone for prison records, the hiring of young black males
is greater than in the employers in general. Whereas once they realize,
if they find somebody whose record is clean, they'll take him.
Yes.
Growing up for myself in inner city Detroit in very desperate situations, and we lived in a tenement, large multi-family dwellings, boarded up windows and doors, sirens and gangs, rats and roaches. It was a miserable environment. I was a pretty awful student and didn't have a lot of belief in myself academically. And neither did my classmates. They all thought I was stupid. They called me dummy. I was the butt of all the jokes. But despite the fact that no one else believed in me, my mother did. You know, we were very poor. There was never money for anything. But it didn't cost anything to get a book from the library. And between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere in the world. I could be anybody. I could do anything. It was like an escape from my world of poverty and violence to places that you could only imagine. I would get on the bus and I would go downtown to the Detroit Institute of Arts and roam through those galleries until I knew every painter who painted each picture and when they were born and when they died and what period it represented. And I was always listening to my portable radio, listening to classical music, and you know, I'd be walking down the streets of Detroit listening to classical music and people thought I was nuts. This guy's crazy. But years later, when I decided that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, well, I wanted to go to the place that's best known for neurosurgery, and that would be Johns Hopkins. But as I said before, they only took 2 people a year out of 125 applicants. But when I got an interview and I went there, the fellow who was in charge of the neurosurgery residency program, George B. Uverhai, was also in charge of cultural affairs at the hospital. And somehow the conversation turned to classical music. And we talked for over an hour about different composers and their styles, conductors, orchestras, orchestral halls. There was no way he wasn't taking me in the program because he had to have somebody to discuss these things with. But what I emphasize to young people all the time is there's no such thing as useless knowledge because you never know what doors it's going to open for you. And the more you know, the more options you have. We cannot trace the origins of a thought. We cannot define where imagination comes from. And I'm not sure we ever will, because that exists in a different dimension. The brain is the conduit through which we reach that other dimension, but we have no way of quantifying and measuring it. But we do have the ability to enjoy it and to use it to the fullest extent. You know, the human brain, if you have an average brain, you're capable of almost anything because of the complexity of our brains. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. It never forgets anything you've ever seen, anything you've ever heard. And, with something like that sitting up here, why would you ever utter the words, I can't?
I've had some emotions that I've had to overcome. I remember when I was looking out my window during the riots when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and I'm looking at all the National Guard outside, and I'm feeling and seeing the anger during that time, and I'm conflicted because I'm dealing with the reality that's painful. I'm dealing with folk who are just doing their job. They're the National Guard, they're called out there. I'm dealing with why we even in this situation to begin with. And then I'm dealing with my training from my father. Love your enemy, don't love what they do, but you gotta love them. You love the sinner and hate the sin. and trying to just balance all of that in my mind and my head. But I've got one other principle I've got to bring to bear, and that is the principle that I was taught, that my faith overrules everything else, even my feelings. And so I had to operate on faith. And I remember asking my father, okay, can I take the guards that were right outside of our house something to drink and something to eat? It's coming to mind now that I actually asked my parents, could I do that as a way of showing grace and kindness in a difficult situation. And of course, that takes me right back to the scripture again of heaping coals on someone's head who may even be an enemy, because you don't know what people are going to say and what people are going to think. And ministering in grace and not succumbing to the vitriol that my environment called for, that was based on legitimate pain, but legitimate fear, because I didn't know what was going to happen next. And moving beyond that. And I've tried to carry that principle with me through life of rising above, not without endorsing the wrong and needing to even condemn the wrong, but rising above it and not succumbing to it. I remember a situation as a grown man, and an Anglo guy comes in and he calls me boy. Now, when he calls me boy, all of my history rises at that point in my mind. One, I'm black, he's white. He's using a term of denigration based on history, and I'm older than him. So all of that is hitting me at the same time, and he calls me boy. So I could feel something revving up inside of me as I wanted to respond, but I decided to pause and whisper a quick prayer. Give me wisdom, Lord, because I don't want to skip it, but I don't want to address it inappropriately either. So I have to push pause. That's a good thing to do when you're upset, is to push pause. Because a few minutes later, another white gentleman came in and he called the white gentleman boy. That changed the whole atmosphere of the conversation. Because where it was personal at first, it was no longer personal because he did it with people in his own race. And so that taught me a great lesson, and that is, when possible, give people the benefit of the doubt, because maybe that was not the intent. Maybe it was not wrong because it was just their habit, and so nothing was meant by it. And this is why, we can't get beyond this racial thing now, because everything is so sensitive that anything can cause an offense. And we gotta learn to push pause and correct things where they're corrected. But even when you correct, speak the truth in love. Let the person know that you want to tell them the truth in a way that heals the problem, not exacerbates or accentuates or makes the problem worse. So when you minister through grace, because we all need grace. In fact, one of the principles that I do remember is that if one day you're gonna need mercy, you better grant it to somebody else. Give them the opportunity to refuse mercy. Don't neglect the responsibility to offer it. I remember when I was denied the opportunity to get on radio, and I was told by one radio station manager, point blank, a black speaker on radio would offend too many of our white listeners. And I will never forget him telling me that, and the feeling I had that my skin color, everybody was telling me, oh, you preach the word, you're teaching the word, but my skin color alone would deny me getting on Christian radio. And that was hurtful. That was hurtful. It was honest, and it could have been true, but it was hurtful, and it was unfair and wrong. But even though that was the case, God overruled it. He brought another Christian leader in who opened up a whole bunch of doors for me to get on radio. So that showed me something too. That the enemy may come in like a flood, but God can raise up a standard against him. And so that let me know that, okay, one person can turn you down, but you know, I got other sheep in this fold, and so I can turn this thing around. And that keeps me from either not getting angry or not lingering in anger, because I know God can interrupt things if I'm doing what I should do. Because a lot of times, people who are legitimately hurt block God from turning it around because they let their own anger, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. And once you take over that role, then you stop God from taking that role in the way he wants to take it. And so you wind up making it worse. And so that's what we're doing. We're making our problems worse and worse and worse, and we're getting further apart and further apart all the time while we're singing songs, praying prayers, and preaching sermons. We're getting further and further apart from each other and from God. So I just say, you know, let's let God be the God he is. And that doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing the right thing that he can work with as we move forward to try to pull together a proper unity so we can have a proper impact in a culture that's on life support.
Manning Johnson was an American Negro who loved his country, and he loved it enough that he saw beyond Uncle Tom. And what he saw there was Uncle Sam. A communist of stature within the international conspiracy, Manning Johnson had the strength to renounce communism when he discovered for certain that its purpose was to use the Negro as a device to help commit all Americans of all colors to a slavery far worse than anything the pre-emancipation American Negro had ever experienced. You are about to listen to Manning Johnson's farewell address. It differs from traditional farewell addresses in that Johnson did not know that this was to be his final speech. He died shortly after the speech was delivered. There is a widespread belief that Mr. Johnson's death was the result of enemy conspiracy. It should be stated here that our own research in connection with his death shows no evidence whatsoever to confirm this suspicion. He was with friends at the time of the automobile accident, which occurred at Lake Arrowhead, California. The nature of the accident, with the car going out of control and down into a ravine, was such that had accidental death come, it more likely would have come to his two friends because of their relative positions in the car. Furthermore, Manning Johnson's death came several days after the accident, from which he had walked away with an audible prayer of gratitude to God on his lips. Manning Johnson died from a coronary condition from which he had suffered silently for many years. The coroner's report, of which I hold a true copy in my hand, corroborates what I have just said about Manning Johnson's death. Manning Johnson served his nation in the military. His remains lie today in Fort Rosecrans Military Cemetery, San Diego, California. For those who may be in the area and wish to visit the grave, the number is 473 in Section U. There is no record of the exact date Manning Johnson delivered this address. We do know that it was made in the Broadway Tabernacle in Seattle, Washington. We preserve the speech on this record for posterity, and we present it with malice toward none, but rather with the belief that had its wisdom and sheer logic reached enough Americans at the time the speech was made, the communists never could have succeeded in provoking the violence and insurrection we have unhappily witnessed. Now, Manning Johnson. At the time someone turned on a tape recorder, he was discussing the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
The NAACP collects millions of dollars through racial incitement. They go out of their way to create race issues, because the more race issues they create, the more they've got an appeal for begging for funds. But what do they do with that money? What do they do with it? They do not spend one single cent to build any factories or shops to create jobs or to contribute to the development of free enterprise in our country. They're not interested in that. In fact, when they hold a convention, they don't even go near the Negro neighborhood when they're spending their money. In Cleveland recently, when they held their convention, they collected money from the business people in Cleveland, the colored business people. They went to a white hotel and they ate in white restaurants. They didn't spend any money in the Negro business places. And yet they say that they're for the race. It's unfortunate that when they were in Washington at this so-called summit conference, they went to the Raleigh Hotel, the white hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. They ate in the restaurants there. They didn't even go near the colored community. They're supposed to represent the colored people. They do not want to spend one single penny of the money that they collect for the purchase of land and home construction. They're not interested in that because they consider the purchase of land and development of a Negro community as segregating yourself. They'd rather see the Negro with nothing and to have that kind of thing developed. They're only interested in one thing, to get into every neighborhood, but build nothing yourself. They spend nothing for specialized training for talented youth. If it wasn't for white philanthropists establishing foundations and contributing money for these purposes, there would be no means of talented young men getting financial aid in order to educate themselves. Then they'll tell you about inequality of education. The communists have planted the idea, don't do anything for yourself, just get out there and fight and yell and scream and demand everything. They don't spend a single penny for building hospitals. I remember back in the 30s there was a campaign to build a big colored hospital in Harlem. And there was an obstreperous group of white liberals and Negroes who were against it. Now here was an opportunity for them to build this hospital that was bound to the credit of the Negro. But this small group vetoed it. Said this is segregating yourself. The Jews and everybody else build hospitals. The Negro won't build any. And he stands off and says, you're segregating yourself when you build it. I don't know by what logic these people come by that. That's a good excuse for doing nothing. And you merit nothing but contempt, because when you don't do anything, people don't have anything but contempt for you. But when they can point to something that you do constructively, they can say with pride, what a fine community of people we have and how industrious and progressive they are. That goes far in the direction of breaking down any prejudice than anything else could do. Not a cent do they spend for convalescent homes and homes for the aged. I know one preacher collected money from his congregation and built a home for the aged, then he kicked them out and moved in himself.
They don't spend a cent. The classes in personal hygiene and sanitation, care and upkeep of property, combating crime and juvenile delinquency. They'll point to juvenile delinquency and crime among the white groups and say, well, there's crime over there, so we got it among ourselves, as if the existence of crime among other racial groups justifies crime among Negroes. And if other groups don't do anything, then they are justified in not doing anything. They don't spend a single penny to aid the Negro youth in preparing for stiff job competition. There are many other things that I could talk about that they don't even consider doing. They'll tell you that's not within our field. You know why that's not within their field? It's because to do those things would eliminate all of this racial friction and unrest, because they would be so busy doing things constructive that will let the Negro lift himself up by his bootstraps that he wouldn't have time to go around and create friction. The communists sold them the idea that a Negro community is a ghetto. That isn't so. Every race and nationality has a community. It's natural for people of the same race and nationality to move in an area and the others come in, and before you know it, you have a community. You go one end of this country to the other. You'll find a German community. You'll find a Polish community. You'll find a Jewish community. You'll find a French community. As many nationalities as you have, you'll find communities across the width and breadth of this nation. Yet when a Negro has a community, they say that's a ghetto. And when they label it a ghetto, then you don't have to take care of it. You don't have to do anything about it. Let it go to seed, go to pot. Well, when you haven't learned to keep your own community, how can you expect to keep anybody else's community if you moved in there? And that's the friction. Just like charity begins at home and spreads abroad. You know what the trouble with the NAACP is? Not only the radical element that we find operating, but you see is that the NAACP always harps on Negro rights, but it never says anything about Negro responsibility. Because there cannot be equal rights without equal responsibility. Take, for example, a simple thing like community development. If the Negro develops a community, make it a model community. And I saw one in Louisville, Kentucky when I was there. God bless that Negro contractor, wherever he is. He built up this community. It's one of the finest I have seen in the country. And one of the first things that the Commonwealth attorney said to me when I came to Louisville was, I want you to see this colored community. He says, we're proud of our colored citizens here. He said they have one of the finest kept communities in our city. That made me very proud because he said whenever strangers come in, we advise them to go over and see this community and see the model home that this Negro contractor has built. Now that example goes a long way in creating a good understanding and appreciation of the Negro's ability. But a small group, a minority of Negro intellectuals are vetoing that certain thing. Now, every race and nationality recognizes differences amongst people. These differences, every race and nationality recognizes the fact that there are differences based upon culture, economic, and social standing. Whether you are German or Greek or Polish or any other nationality, they recognize it. because some people are more studious than others. They study more and they acquire knowledge. People are more industrious than others and they acquire wealth and position. Then there are people who have traditions and background of culture. So they're just taken for granted. They have naturally, people gravitate according to their level in society. It's a natural thing. But certain intellectuals, they are telling the Negro that we're going to crash everything. We're not going to recognize this as far as the other groups are concerned. If they don't let us in, we're going to call them discriminators. They don't let us in, we're going to call them discriminators. And when they do that, they cause a lot of friction and bitterness. And people who had no prejudice against them automatically become prejudiced. Because they know that the very persons that you're trying to bring in do not, on the basis of their cultural, financial, or any other standing, belong there. Even the Negroes themselves have a caste system. There are certain Negroes who don't associate with other Negroes and don't want them around. They have their dances and their parties and their affairs. And other Negroes, except they get an invitation, can't come in. Take the Caribbean, for example. They have caste systems all through there. In Haiti, Jamaica, and everywhere else. This isn't accidental. This exists all over the world. Take India, for example, with its untouchables. They've got a caste system in Japan. They've got caste systems in every country in that part of the world. What they are doing is sending the Negro after solutions of problems that almost 2,000 years of Christianity and the other religions have not solved. And when you begin to go after century-old problems and try to solve in ours, you're going to have friction. There are so many other things that energy could be used to advance the cause than going after that type of solution. The Supreme Court, in its decision, upset the question of separate but equal educational facilities. Let us examine that for a moment. Under separate but equal, the southern states where we have a biracial society and have had, and much of it was by agreement with the Negro himself, because most of the Negro church organizations came about as a result of the desire of the Negroes themselves to separate. That's how your African Methodist Church came into being. The Negroes used to worship with the white people in the South. They used to attend the same churches. The Negroes themselves decided that they would withdraw from the white churches, and they established their own church known as the African Methodist Church. Of course, there are a lot of agitators who tell you that just the opposite is true. In addition to that, it is also interesting to note that separate schools, many parts of the South, were voted for and approved by the Negro leaders themselves. Take in North Carolina, through there, the Negro Republicans voted and decided that there should be a separation of the educational institutions. This biracial setup has gone on in the South for a number of years. There have been many problems growing out of it, racial friction and so forth and so on, many acts of violence, many inequities, and many injustices. But interracial commissions were set up in the South, and these commissions were composed of responsible white and Negro leaders in the South. And they were doing a pretty good job. When there was friction between the two groups, they sought to find a solution. And as a result of it, much of the progress that has been made in establishing good relations in the South can be laid at the door of the interracial commission that functioned in the South and enjoyed considerable respect and prestige. The schools, many of them, were inferior to those that were provided for the white students in the South. The Supreme Court decision was a form of pressure on the South to equalize educational facilities. And as a result, the South built many new schools, many of them far superior to those that were attended by white children. The lion's share of the appropriation went for that purpose. What is the situation today? As a result of it, 131,000 Negro teachers man those educational institutions. The Supreme Court, by its decision, has relieved the South of all responsibility to equalize educational facilities in the South. The Supreme Court doesn't make appropriations. Doesn't. And if the legislatures in the southern states don't make the appropriations to equalize schools, the Supreme Court's not going to do it, and they can't force them to do it. And the result is that they have relieved the South of any responsibility to equalize education for Negroes. Now, the NAACP has gotten a token number of Negroes integrated in schools. They consider that a great victory, but I say it's a Pyrrhic victory. In the first place, who said that Negroes can't get an education in the South? Any Negro in the South who wants an education can get one. And the facilities were gradually being equalized. Who said that 130,000 Negroes were so inferior that they're incapable of teaching their own children? Now, if a Negro thinks that his own people are so incapable of teaching his own children, how should he expect white people to send their children to that inferior Negro teacher? And right. And I wouldn't let the Supreme Court or anybody else put the stigma of inferiority on teachers of my own race. Sometimes I think that they're only concerned because a socialist radical came over here and wrote a book on the American dilemma, that Gunnar Marital, that the only way you're going to get equal education is for a Negro to sit beside a white child. Negro child to sit beside a white child. Now let's look at the logic of that, if there is any logic in it. Do you know that the only way that a child is going to get ahead, not by who you sit beside, but by the amount of attention that you pay to what the teacher teaches you, and what you get at home, and what you're willing to do in extra study. Those are the things that enable you to get ahead, not who you sit beside. So that equalizing of education doesn't mean that it's equalized by sitting beside somebody, but it's equalized on the basis of having the same educational facilities. Now, if they were reasonable and logical, they know it's a biracial society there, that if they didn't like to go to school there, they want to send their kids, just send them north or in the east or the west to schools where they're integrated. But don't spread the rumor throughout the world that Negroes are kept in ignorance because of prejudiced white people and all of that propaganda, because that type of propaganda is the brainchild of the communists. They want to use it, and they want to use the Negro to gain foothold in those parts of the world where the darker races exist. They don't give a tinker's damn about a Negro. You know what a Tinker's Dam is, don't you? I saw some of you looking proud. Well, a guy that tinkers uses a soldering iron. He uses a soldering iron. So he builds a little dam. He builds a little dam in order to hold that solder. And that's what's meant by it. So I don't want you to get the wrong impression here. But what the Supreme Court did was open the Pandora box. They have created the fertile soil for the operation of the worst type of elements on both sides. And as a result of this, race relations have been set back 50 years in this country. Americans who were previously gradually working out their problems, and when there were solutions of these problems, they came from the heart, and there wouldn't be any going back on them. It's different now. White Americans are taking sides. Negro Americans are taking sides. That friendliness that existed at the workbench and over the backyard fence beginning to vanish in the thin air. There are tensions, bitterness, frustration, and hate. And America, as a result of all of this, faces a long period of tension, bitterness, and distrust. All of the goodwill and brotherhood that has been built up over the years has gone practically by the board. And heaven knows where it will end. I remember back there in this resolution, all of this that's transpiring today, the communists talked about in 1928. In section number 7, for example, says the Negro question in the United States must be treated in its relation to the Negro questions and struggles in other parts of the world. The Negro race everywhere is an oppressed race, whether it is a minority in the USA, majority South Africa, or inhabits a so-called independent state, Liberia. The Negroes are oppressed by imperialism. A strong Negro revolutionary movement in the USA will be able to influence and direct the revolutionary movements in all those parts of the world where the Negroes are oppressed by imperialism. Now, this was in 1928. So, it is clear that the communists are deliberately developing issues and campaigns and actions that could be used for propaganda among the Negroes and among their blood brothers in Africa. The Reds want to take over Africa. They want to drive out the British, the French, the Belgian, and the Portuguese. And they want to replace their rule with Soviet rule. In spite of all of the objections that I have against any other ruling in Africa, I say Africa should be for the Africans. But I would prefer seeing them there than to see Red Russia go in. Because under them you have hope. But under the communists you have none. Of course, the Reds seek to exploit the national ambitions of the Africans. They took some of the young Africans to Moscow. They sent them to school. They gave them training. And then they sent them back to Africa to take part in and lead the African nationalist movement. They promised them arms and money and everything else, much of which they gave them. Moscow isn't interested in African freedom. They're interested in using the African for their purposes. And when they get through with him, they'll make him work for them. And when he tries to rebel, they'll bring the Red Armies from China and Russia to crush him with superior arms. You can't play with those devils without getting burned. And I hope and pray Almighty God that in the struggles and the aspirations of the African people for freedom, that they will shun the Reds as a righteous man shuns sin and the devil. The communists, in order to impress the Africans and the Asians, brought before the United Nations a charge that the United States was resorting to genocide insofar as the Negro is concerned, that they were trying to murder all the Negroes in America. Now, everybody knows that that isn't so, but they brought that charge as a propaganda measure against the country. What is significant that this whole integration campaign coincided with Russia's stepped-up campaign in Africa and Asia. I wonder sometimes if this was just a mere coincidence, or whether this whole thing wasn't planned. I think the races were getting along too well and beginning to solve their problems. Negroes were getting jobs they never held before. Things were getting along pretty smoothly. Now everything is just topsy-turvy now. And I wonder if this whole thing was just a mere coincidence, or was it a part of a planned scheme? Of course, the northern politicians, they try to convince the Negro that they're in his corner. They're a bunch of hypocrites. They only flatter the Negro. They flatter him because they want to use his vote. That's all. The Negro will have to learn to think and plan for himself and do the things which he thinks is best for himself. This integration stuff is gone to all sorts of extremes. So much so that Negro intellectuals are opposing housing developments in Negro neighborhoods. Now, housing developments are for the purpose of eliminating slums. Now, where there are slum conditions in Negro communities, these Negro intellectuals would rather have the slums than have a housing development because they say it'll mean segregation of the Negro. We want integration. They don't want any more Negro business, and that Negro business which exists, they say that that should be integrated. Well, if it's integrated, what has he got? He wants to lose everything. They even want to close down the Negro churches. They don't want them anymore. Want everything integrated. Everybody else wants to keep their church. But he wants to close his down, integrate it. It's all right if those people want to integrate and they want to join, that's perfectly all right. But why all of a sudden you got to just break up everything? I don't know what kind of spirit that is when you just break up everything. Helter-skelter, headlong, like a bunch of cattle in the situation. It just doesn't make sense. I don't know how these people think. One writer in a newspaper said they ought to close down all Negro colleges. They don't want Negro colleges anymore. They do not want to build anything, most of them who talk for this, and they have nothing to offer to any other group. But they want to force themselves everywhere, and as a result, they create friction. The Reds started all of this integration stuff, and they have been using the Negro in this because they wanted the Negro to unite with the white communists. That was their objective, not with the other white people, but with the white communists. And as a result, they have destroyed all pride amongst them. Race pride has been destroyed. solidarity and concerted effort on the part of the race has disappeared. The Negro intellectual is so sold on integration that he doesn't see the necessity of doing anything for his race, by his race, and with his race. He has naturally an inferiority complex himself, and he wants to get lost and swallowed up in the white group. Unfortunately, it's only a Negro minority of intellectuals and leftist Negro preachers who presume to speak for all of the Negro people. They try to silence all opposition by calling anybody who disagrees with them as Uncle Toms. The Reds are giving full support to the NAACP in this whole program because the program creates friction and tension, bitterness and hate, and provokes violence. And the communists thrive on that. Some of the liberals and the communists and all of that ilk, along with NAACP leaders, have been demanding more and more federal power. They want laws to turn the FBI into a Gestapo to hunt down everybody who disagrees with integration. They even propose laws to give the federal government the right to step into states and arrest governors. They want to take away all power from the states. And when this sort of thing happens, then we're on the road to dictatorship. And once you have given the federal government that power, it can be used against you. Depends upon who seizes control of the federal government. Today you may have men of goodwill wielding that power. Tomorrow you might have men of ill will and ill repute. So you have to be careful. And there are certain people who are using the Negro in order to establish that power in Washington. And the Negro is just merely a pawn in a game that's bigger than he is. It is our duty to arrest this development toward the concentration and centralization of power in Washington. If we do not arrest this development, then we're on the road to dictatorship. Beneath all of the racial unrest, at the root of all racial unrest in the country, is the clammy, cold, bloody hand of communism. We must arrest it, and we must try to bring America back to sanity. And let us pray and work that the misunderstanding, the bitterness, the hate, and the frustration, and the tension that exists may disappear, and that the Spirit of God, the Spirit of truth, the Spirit of charity may prevail again amongst our people.